How about that? It looks like I've got some signal now. Hello, Marvin. Good to see you. Didn't know if you were going to be around. PJ. Kaipo, good now. Kaipo, was that Nikki or is that Amanda or somebody else new? Um, Nikki. Yeah, that's what I thought. I couldn't remember. So, yeah, this, what I was just saying is Justin's in. This chat got the single most RSVPs, and even just posting that meme on a couple forums got this polarized response. And even in my own gaming group, it got this polarized response. So, I'm expecting this is going to be hot. Okay, got my new microphone set up. Good to see you, Marvin. We definitely got to get to some gaming. It's been crazy since the end of the semester. Marvin's a student of mine. Yeah, the hot takes are gonna be coming in pretty hot. I think I've got one from who's already written me pages in private text on this, and I'm like, look, just save it. We want to talk about this online. Lukewarm take. I'm shockingly neutral on this, and we're gonna get to that. I'll wait till see if a couple other people pop in, and then we'll get rolling with it. So, the full disclosure is I started playing this game when it was entirely rooted in Tolkien, right? Um, then Risk Monopoly combined, and more friendships than Risk and Monopoly combined, or what's the other game? We just were talking about another game that has a very similar effect on player. More than 40K, more than World of Warhammer. We discussed that last time. Losing real life friends over, oh, I'm sorry, World of Warcraft. Losing real life friends over World of Warcraft. I think I lost one friend over 40K. He was just a jerk anyway. Yeah, 40K is a good friendship killer too. I've definitely had some tense moments in that. It's part of the reason why I don't. I mean, that's the main reason why I don't want to play is because I just can't spend the time and money on it. But so, you know, the reality is a risk can break down. Yeah, can break down. There's another game we were just talking about too, in my game chat that my gaming group. Yeah, 40K. I think we talked about this. I know I talked about this in the game design class. Is the big flaw of 40K is actually something we're going to touch on tonight too. That like every codex that comes out is more powerful than the last, and it was the same thing in D&D in the early version of D&D where they had a different character race book, and like everything got more ridiculous. Yeah, yeah, it's weird. And like I said, we talked a little bit during the last chat about World of Warcraft and losing like real life friends over raids and stuff. And that's actually what, like I've said last time, that's when I bowed out of that whole culture. I was just like, I just can't do this. Like this guy's been over our house and we've babysat his kids and he's there like yelling at me during a raid. I was like, nope, we're done. Sorry. Like no. No, we're good. We're good. So this I'll just jump in. The starting point of this whole discussion came in when I, for the first time in at least 10 years now, sat down to make a dedicated 5th edition D&D character. Now I'd played two games recently. Um these are I two games recently in which I played 5th ed characters, but they were limited run games. They were characters that came in at a higher power level. There was not any kind of real investigation into the rules or into Roll 20, or I'm sorry, D&D Beyond. But we spent a good amount of time last Thursday night in D&D Beyond prepping for Blake's 5th ed game. He's been playing Torn now for a few years. He finally has just said, I think when we're done with Warhammer, this break of Warhammer fantasy, we're going to go to D&D. And um I guess I was kind of amazed logging in, and now Tom, who has it all set up, and he has a really high end account because he's run several campaigns and he plays in several campaigns. I logged in. There were about 20 race choices, including like Githyanki and or Githarze, and all these really kind of like I was like, wait, that's a playable race now, And again, this is coming from a guy who saw those in the Fiend Folio. And I don't know what year was it, PJ? 1982, 83. I don't know. Some ridiculous, or 85 maybe, some ridiculous bygone era where, there was no thought that you could ever actually play. Yeah, pre-thrash metal. Yeah, exactly. It was pre-thrash metal. That says a lot right there. And you could play these races. And not to mention there's the Genasi, there are I forget their name. Tom's playing one, the half angelic beings, the tieflings, which are now kind of dated. They've already been around 10 years. 81, 81. Well, homebrew races, we'll talk about that too. And I was just kind of blown away. And again, the tiefling, yeah, tiefling, Azamari. That's it, the Azamari, yeah. And I was just kind of like, wow. These are all out of my whole joke all week has been, okay, who's playing the half Mind Flayer, half Centaur, Like, let's just get, like, totally ridiculous here. And I've been kind of busting on it, and especially because Blake's, like, a diehard D&Der. Like, he just loves D&D and everything about it. And, I mean, so do I. But he's, like, really diehard, so I've been kind of just busting on him all week, like, oh, Blake, my Mind Flayer character's done, And he's like, we've gone back and forth. And, again, we've known each other longer than Dinosaur most recently. So I was hoping you would join in, actually, Nikki, because I know you had some really unique characters based on your drawings and the characters you have your drawings. So this is where the whole crux of the discussion comes in is we have a definite generational shift in these races that come into these games and what's considered a normal game race. And I think this talk speaks quite a bit to all the other discussions, cultural discussions about shifting gender identities and a greater acceptance of multiculturalism in society abroad. Now, fortunately, despite all the neckbeards I've known, I've also known most gamers to be pretty open-minded. If you gamed, you gamed, and they really didn't care about much else. And occasionally you'd get into arguments over something. But for the most part, if you were there to game, you were there to game. And in the metal culture, it's kind of the same way. I mean, there are people with shitty opinions in metal. We all know them. Some of them are musicians we know, and I know personally, or I consider their opinions shitty. They consider mine shitty, right? So, but when it comes down to it, we're there for the music, and it's not a thing. We don't make it a thing unless it's a thing. Unless it's an extreme case, like certain very recent famous members who did some band members of who did some really effed up things. I mean, I've got a couple metal hot takes too. I know members of the band, one of whom was arrested on January 6th, and the dude from Cannibal Corpse with his meth lab and his multiple assault rifles and flamethrowers. I mean, like, you're just sitting there like, man, this is crazy. But as a whole, the subculture has always been more accepting than mainstream culture of different people, of a variety of different opinions. And I think we see that reflected in a lot of modern gaming, particularly D&D, particularly that some of these races have been co-opted by very specific sections of society and subcultures. So I think there's the conversation opener was my experience recently logging into D&D Beyond and being like, wow, and I ended up playing a dwarf. Okay, so I'm playing a dwarf cleric. So I actually went with something that was fairly straightforward. The temperament of the game is somewhere between more traditional and more fantastic D&D wise. So I think we have the Asmar, and we have an elf and a dwarf and a human so far as the maid. And Blake said you're welcome to make anything you want. If you want to play bugbear, play bugbear. But you've got to work it into the game. And that's kind of the takeaway I've had from a lot of the conversations today is what what to what degree does the game master impose their worldview on the campaign, and does that adjust what the players do? This gets into our long discussion last week about player agency in world building, and that's this whole other discussion. But I kind of broke my opening volley, and I started this earlier this week after making my character. I thought about it all weekend. It was in my little brain, and then Monday I kind of sent out this text to the group, and I said, "So is D and D now its own genre? Is D and D now its own genre that's separate from what we consider fantasy?" And I think that's an interesting question. And that's kind of where I've resolved with it, that it's a very different thing than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when it was rooted essentially in Tolkien and well, just D&D or tabletops in general. That's really interesting because I know you have played a lot of other games more than D&D from what I remember, right? That accommodate extremely diverse, unusual character types. So, but is D&D well, so you kind of hate D&D. There's a lot of players, your generation and maybe the generation after that. I think you and Marvin are about the same age. You're not, young. You're not just getting out of high school, but you're still younger than PJ and I. Of course, most of the world's younger than PJ and I at this point. But I think there's a lot of younger gamers who don't actually really like D&D, and I've got one, and I don't think they're at all interested in coming on these chats, which is a shame because their viewpoints are really interesting. I met them at one of the LARPs. They're trans. They're Israeli originally. They have this very unique worldview, that's very different than most people you talk to, and it's really interesting. And they're like, the more I play D&D, the more I hate it, and they're in a very open world kind of LARP. So the battle system is still mathy, but it yeah, there's a lot of micromanaging, and Pathfinder takes that one step further. I know Marvin and I, in D&D is a gateway to other game systems, and Marvin and I have talked about Pathfinder, whereas Pathfinder's great, but you've got to be so invested in Pathfinder to to be a thing. So the reason why I'm focusing on D&D is two reasons. Because it has the legacy of being the first, maybe the first fantasy role playing game. There could still be debate about this. But not only that, it goes further, and it's an RPG. Yeah, it is the RPG. And then it also has become pop culture, and it's the most familiar name, and that's why I'm focusing on D&D. But this applies to a lot of things. I mean, most of you know I'm writing my own game, and some of you I think have already read or looked at the source, and that's it right here. That it is a human-centric game. There are no other playable races at this time or in the foreseeable future besides humans. And I focus on cultural development analogous to our Fertile Crescent, perhaps at a Bronze Age level of society. So but it's meant to be a very different kind of game. It's not D&D. Yeah, even if we're playing Fate, you say D&D night because you know what it means. Exactly. So that's why I'm talking about D&D here. And I'm also talking about D&D because originally in D&D you played a fighter, a thief, a wizard, a cleric, or a halfling, or a dwarf, or an elf, or a wizard. Yes, you could play a wizard too. So you didn't even have this variety of race and class. Your race became your class. If you weren't an elf, a dwarf, or a halfling, you were a human. And that is kind of the Tolkien view. There he is. There's Adam. We're waiting for the hot takes. I've already talked about your lengthy text messages to me, and I was finally like, I'm not going to talk about this anymore until tonight. Wizard, D4 hit points. So Adam, my first opening comment is D&D its own genre? And Nikki asked, are we just talking about D&D here? And I said, for our purposes, we're talking about D&D because it has the legacy. So I just backtracked and talked about a little bit about how in early D&D you didn't even have races and classes. You just had a race or a class, and if you were a halfling, that was your class and your race. So that's kind of where we're at now. And so the whole kind of thrust was, is D&D its own genre at this point. And yes, this extends to other fantasy role playing games, but I'm focusing on D&D slash Pathfinder because they're interrelated. I don't need an answer. I'm not looking for an answer. I guess I'm just kind of throwing this out there to see, if anyone has any thoughts. Is it a fantasy game or is it its own thing? Die for emotional damage, yeah. Killed by the house cat. That was always our joke. In our very first ed D&D game in high school, we had a guy killed by a house cat. Had a wizard killed by a house cat. It scratches you for 2 points of damage. I'm dead. Yeah, you are. So that was kind of the joke. So that's the question. Is D&D its own genre? I think that's kind of the opinion of the discussion. And we had this whole discussion on my text thread of my regular gaming group, and kind of the end retort, which I will save for the end here, that Blake gave me. And I said, okay, but you just kind of reiterated exactly what I started this conversation with. Is D&D its own genre? And you just said yes, effectively, and again, it's not as clear cut as that. So, so we'll go on from there. Is it a subgenre of fantasy? Is Dragon Riders of Pern and D&D, are they analogous in terms of let's see. Oh, so yes, we talked a little about the corporate nature of D&D last time, and I've been thinking a lot about that comment, PJ. I have some feedback on that, but that I think might be for another chat. I think D&D is an entirely corporate move to de-radicalize itself in the modern era. It's laudable, entirely move it further open to brand more players. Well, we've talked about this. So, two of the regular players in our game are my significant other, Diana, who's a veterinarian, and her tech and longtime friend, a friend of us, Mel. And Mel's right around 30. I don't remember the exact age, right around 30. But she openly talks about playing D&D with all her friends, and we still cringe because for us it's still this stigma. Like, oh my God, what do you do on your weekends? You sit around, you pretend you're an elf. What's wrong with you? And then we come to realize there are more people doing this now and more people becoming famous doing this, than anyone else. And that's why I kind of, and I'll be honest, when I got out of grad school, I was still doing a lot of game writing, but when I got into the proper fine arts, I had so many like creative people be like, oh yeah, I used to play D&D, and I don't spend my time on that anymore. You kind of get programmed into it. And then like in the last 5 years, especially since I've started up with my own gaming projects again and started teaching it at the college level, I've started kind of getting like, well, who's laughing now, buddy? Like no one's ever going to hear of you, but everybody knows what Critical Role is, Yeah, the wizard had D4 hit points and D&D led to Satanism. Well, kind of right there. Case in point, not Satanism, but alternate views of reality. I definitely know enough D&D players with alternate views of reality. So we go from this post-Tolkienian kind of world with a little bit of Conan and a little bit of Fritz Lieber and a little bit of Michael Moorcock for the dark end of it, for the dark sorcery end of it. And now we have, cat people and lizard men and, Kenku and all these like kind of really strange so race is an extremely bad way of discussing it. And we'll get to that. Species is a more awkward word, but race has different connotations. In Harrowed Land, I call the different human groups cultures. I do not call them races because that has a connotation of eugenics and has a connotation of all these things. Now, yes, race, I still use race for fantasy races. An orc's a fantasy race, an elf is a fantasy race. They're not cultures because they are different species. So perhaps species is the best word. So maybe that's the best way to start this, is to break it down. And is race a really bad way to say this? Because race is an invention of post-colonialism, right? The notion of race was invented by colonial Europe. All right, there's no way around this. There's no way around this. And, I imagine some people might tune into this broadcast and send me hate mail because I'm politicizing D&D, but it's not politics, it's history. It's human history. Race also implies exactly, technically race implies they're the same species. But that's another discussion that we can have in terms of what actually fantasy races are, which might be too big for this hour and change chat. So, yeah, right? So, my immediate gut response is, and this was partially to be, let's see, King Philip came over from Genoa singing Rammstein. Yeah. My initial kind of one of my other hair trigger comments to my group was all right, well, is D&D just anime now? Now, okay, full disclosure, I know a couple of you here really love anime. You probably remember me saying it's not my favorite thing, and that's not a dig. That's not because I hate anybody or anything related to it. I've just never gotten used to the art style. Just plain and simple. Not my preferred medium of animation. But is D&D basically anime now? And I said that to a group of 48 to 54-year-olds. And I did that intentionally because I wanted to kind of hair trigger this conversation among my group before I brought it to a larger audience. And I think the best response I got is, so my whole opinion of that was anthropomorphism, right? The subcultures related to anime and fandom and furries and all this other stuff, and is a lot of what we see in D&D now a direct stem off of that, and that becoming more popularized in geek culture, gaming culture. And again, I said it in an intentionally kind of hair trigger way to see how my friends responded. The best response I got was from my friend Tom, who said, no, I watch a lot of anime, and I don't think it's much like anime. It's more like the Star Wars universe now. I was like, man, he just got me. I'm like, that was perfect. That was, in a way, a perfect summation of what I've been trying. It's pretty apt, right? A perfect summation of what I've been trying to define looking at this kind of new culture. Yes, surprise. It's amazing. I wish Tom would. I don't think Tom's into doing this, but I wish he were, because that is, yeah. Well, exactly. And again, I'm that guy who's looking at anime more or less from the outside and being like, oh, anime, it's all like, I know it's not. Yeah, I know very well it's not. I've dealt with a lot of folks who are into it deeply as part of their subculture, who as a fandom, and I know it's not. And you know what? I've seen some I absolutely really like. I'm just never been my main thing. And exactly, D&D Beyond's listing of player races is like the cantina scene. Exactly. And I think that's very interesting. I think that's interesting because you're getting dog bombed. He has his teddy bear. He wants us to play with him. Come here. Speaking of weird races, I have an Alaskan Malamute here, which is one of the sources of Chewbacca, and I can assure you that living with him is very much like living with a Wookiee. Is that he occasionally will sit next to me on the couch and howl in my ear when I'm trying to watch TV. And I'm like Han Solo, like pushing him away, like just stop. He definitely has his own personality. He's not a golden retriever. Here he's stalking me with his teddy bear, trying to get me to play with him. So, yeah. So it's more like the Star Wars universe, right? Where you can go into a tavern. Yeah, I know. So I've seen the photos of your guys, PJ, and Jen's told me a little bit about them. So you go into a tavern in D&D in some worlds, and you can feel like you're in the Star Wars cantina. Is this good or is it bad? And that's the whole, and what's good and bad? And again, this goes back to our discussion last week, right? Our discussion last week was hardcore versus casual gaming. And again, these are very ambiguous discussions, right? These are very labeled discussions. So you have a corgi man named Dino, and the party immediately fell in love with him. So it's funny, and I actually texted Lauren, who was in a class with Marv, in a photo class, who she has tattoos of her D&D or her D&D characters, right? I mean, very hardcore. And she was talking about these very emotional attachments she has with her characters and her campaigns. Whereas, again, I'm more literary, abstracted about this. If my dwarf cleric dies in a couple weeks, he dies. Again, I've also been doing this a very long time. So it's an interesting discussion we're having about the relationship people have, especially people coming into the game in the past 10 years or 5 years or 2 years than what a lot of us did with our D&D characters, where early D&D characters were basically video game. They're basically Doom, right? You're a guy with a sword, a hand with a sword. Like that was early D&D. You're going through and killing monsters and taking their treasure. So I think the whole dynamic of the game has changed what people want to play. And this conversation evolves, and I think what I've come to, and Adam and I have talked about this, and Adam's probably even more. Okay, he's not conservative in any way, shape, or form except his D&D games and what races he wants in his D&D games. In context, is 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 it good or bad to have this huge variety of possible races? And I think this desire to play these races does come from anime, because I've had a lot of students relate their D&D games, or even people closer to my age relate their D&D games to anime stories and their characters to anime characters. Is it that the culture that is coming into the gaming, that is coming into RPGs, is more diverse and more open to different ideas and bringing their own influences, like modern cartoons, modern movies? I've talked about my friend from Taiwan, Jim, where his idea of fantasy is guys flying around and throwing fireballs at each other all the time, and kung fu. It's all like Hong Kong action fantasy. I don't know if you ever met. I don't know if you ever met Jim Adam. He was in that crew. So at that point, is it also talking a little bit about multiculturalism in these games? Because don't forget, in Indian folklore, a guy with a tiger head walking around isn't strange, right? A talking bird, or a bird that can't talk to you but has magic powers, a kenku, is right out of Japanese folklore. So these aren't the rakshasa, yeah. These aren't strange. Whereas a dwarf in a lot of Japanese folklore is like a little bit more evolved than a short Sasquatch. Like when they say the Korobokoro, the dwarves, that's it's different culturally than the Scandinavian dwarves or the Germanic dwarves or the fairies in Irish folklore. So again, is this infusion into gaming also talking about the breakdown of the Eurocentrism of RPGs, of traditionally Western RPGs? And I think it's an interesting point. And I mean, I don't, I'm not pinning this as good or bad, or that it is, I'm not positioning this as a social statement. Is it just a natural response when you have generations of new players who come in from their own cultures, different cultures, non-Western cultures, non-Eurocentric cultures, we'll say, because a person from Mexico is still from a Western culture, right? Pick up a thick German accent. We'll talk about accents in a little bit too. Durin, yeah. Well, that's what I was just gonna say. We'll talk about accents too, especially dwarf accents. We had a whole conversation about that Thursday night. So I think that's the cultural context I ended up framing this discussion in. Do younger fans or newer fans from different places bring in something different? And who are we to like invalidate all this? Who are these old guard players to invalidate this? I don't think it's our job. I think we should embrace it. And does this represent a shift in the hobby in general? And a lot of it does come from what was said initially, the greater accessibility of the hobby, thanks to Hasbro / Wizards of the Coast, thanks to Critical Role, thanks to Stranger Things. More people understand D&D, and they are getting into it despite their backgrounds. I remember having non-white friends growing up who were really into comics, really into fantasy, but their family would absolutely not let them play a role-playing game because it was weird, because it was the devil, because it was all these other things. But I had white friends like that too. But I distinctly remember a Latino and a black friend who really wanted to get into all this. And they were like, no, I can never do that. You know, they were like, my family would, my cousins, they would never stop busting on me because I'd be into this. And I think that was in general a rule, but I think it was definitely prominent among people from other cultures besides suburban white kids. So I think that's something we have to really acknowledge, that it's very easy for Adam and I to say, nope, dwarves and elves only, or whatever. or PJ, but I know PJ's pretty eclectic. But that's in a way doing a disservice to people. Was the home for weirdos? Yeah. It was never a case where I ever had other players lock out someone because they were different. In most cases, it was that person felt very self conscious because of their family or whatever that they weren't allowed to do this. So back to what Adam and PJ kind of talked about a little bit at one point about it being corporate. Now, I'm going to backtrack on that a little bit because I think it does feed into this particular discussion. I would argue fourth ed was corporate D&D. And I would argue that because they unapologetically said we are taking everything from World of Warcraft that had at that point, 20 million players or whatever, and we're putting it in D&D. I mean, they more or less said that. We're changing characters to be more like MMO characters. They out and out said that, and they did it. And they did things. Now, they added a few things, like refreshable actions for healing surges, refreshable actions for all character classes. So your wizard wasn't just casting a spell and not doing anything else. Your fighter wasn't just going to swing a sword and not do anything else. I think it was a tabletop MMO. Yeah, it was awful. Yeah, it was awful. It was a good board game. I played a board game made out of it at one point. It was a good board game. Awful RPG. So what happened with fifth ed is people rebelled against fourth ed, this commoditized version of the game so heavily that they turned around and they created fifth ed, which actually is very RP centric and very loose for rules, right? Like it's very for D&D, whereas I have Nikki saying it's really rulesy and really mathy. Those of us who played second ed are like, oh, this is easy. We don't have to think about this. There's no THAC0. You have to sit and calculate on a calculator whether or not you could hit a creature mid combat. So I think that has definitely been a change because they had their player base tell them what they wanted out of the game. And a lot of that player base at that time was early 20s to 30s, balancing out these guys who wanted it to go back to second ed D&D, And I'm saying guys there unapologetically because it's 90%. Who do we got here? Not as Wolfie. Hi, Wolfie. Introduce yourself, Wolfie. Not as bad as some of the modifiers from Arduin. I haven't played Arduin, so I don't know. Oh, it's Ross. Hey, how's it going, man? How are you? Good to hear you. Good to see you. So, it's not as bad as some other games. It's not as bad as Rollmaster. Rollmaster was even worse, and your character died 10 minutes after you made it. So, so I would argue there at that point that fifth ed became what the players really kind of wanted to see out of the game. Oh yeah, I don't think I looked at that. I've heard about it, but I haven't looked at it. And I would argue that the introduction of these new players that came in and helped shape fifth ed, the player fifth ed helped shape fifth ed, and a lot of people busted like, oh well, they just got the players to rewrite fourth ed and they published it. I'm like, yeah, they did, and you know what? It worked. It's the single most popular version of the game ever. And there are certain people who shouldn't hear me say this because I bust on them sometimes. It's probably the most well-constructed version of the game ever from a game design perspective. It actually really works. All of it really works. And you can step in and have a group, and I've talked about this in my other chats, have a group who's never heard of this game playing it in a half an hour. And that's something to say. And for as much as any of us old guys might be like, oh, well, there's all these weird races and these characters are all fluffy. I'm like, yeah, but you've got millions of players. You've got people who've created these entire other industries and cultures out of D&D. So I think it says something that, yes, it's the most accessible version. Maybe that's what we mean by corporate. It's the new metal of role playing games, if we want to say that, which by no means it's bad. It's just created from the viewpoint of a different culture and a different generation who have made it into something they really like. And I was very resistant to it for a long time. Only because I just didn't want to learn another version of the game. And I really like 3.5. I really like 3.0, It's still my favorite version of the game because of the Pathfindery numbers. And like I said, I really like Pathfinder. But you could get anyone into 5th Ed D&D. And again, I have players who had never even touched the game before who became devotees. You know. Whereas Pathfinder, I think, allows for these great character options, but you got to be willing to, invest days of your life making your character. So that's and I like 3 Point. Right. I like the extended skills. I like the extended feats. I like all that. Yep. And the very loose dicing system of the newer model of Roll20 allows a person to not think as much about the game once they start playing. And I think that's important for the player. So, okay, so talking a little bit about, well, I was just going to segue back to the discussion of races, and actually, Russ, you probably would have been interested in this. We got into the whole discussion that race is really a bad way to talk about this because it has all these post-colonial connotations. That the word race itself is a post-colonial construct, and culture or species is probably a much better way to discuss it. Let's say if you're talking about an ogre and a human, right? I mean, they're not the same species. They might be related. And that's what where I'm going to go next. So you have all of these species in your average D&D Pathfinder, whatever game, that are all, are they all Star Trek? Are they all Klingons with pointy, or Klingons with weird heads and Vulcans with pointy ears? Like, are we disservicing? And this is something Adam and I have really talked about. Are you disservicing the culture, the inherent culture of these cultures, these species, by casting them as basically modified humans? Why not? You say nope. Kaipo's like, nope. You have a Minotaur in your game. Okay, yeah. But they're still mythologically based off of a humanoid or a transformed human. If we want to go back to the roots. So you had a raptor. Okay, that's getting a little more out there. That's a little bit less. But how easy is it for you to play that raptor? The weirdest character I play is a Thrykeen. I think that's the pronunciation. A Thrykeen, the Mantis people from Dark Sun. And it worked great until he started eating all the NPCs. And the game master was just like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm a praying mantis. Like, they're nothing but food for me. The game kind of shortly devolved after that. But what prevents these races / cultures / species from just being humans? And this goes back to the discussion we had Thursday night. And Adam and I have talked about this because Adam loves dwarves. Corporate Ninja loves dwarves. He is a dwarf man. He's a dwarf in human clothing, sort of. Actually, he's just a dwarf. But besides that, someone said when I was making my dwarf cleric, "Oh, you're gonna have a Scottish accent?" I was like, "Why? Why would?" Oh, vegetarian mind flayer. So that's gonna be mind flayers were playable in Spelljammer, right? Like, I thought at some point somebody was going to make a mind flayer, and I was like, anyway. So I said, why do dwarves have Scottish accents? Because of Pete Jackson's movies? I mean, first of all, it started out as a great representation of Gimli the Dwarf. It ended up as a horrendous representation of Gimli the Dwarf. Whole other tangent. But why do they have Scottish accents? Why do we have to equate them? First of all, if we're going to equate them to a real world mythology, they should have Scandinavian or Germanic accents. Yes. Half Scottish. See, exactly. The D&D dwarves are more closely related to the Scandinavian or Germanic concept of the dwarf. There's really nothing in Scottish folklore that's quite like that, so why give them the Scottish accent? We could get into another territory now, which hints at the dark side of Tolkien. that he identified dwarves as a Semitic people. Okay, so that's a whole other problem, like right there. And I've always championed Tolkien in that he's not a racist or anything like that, but I saw the interview where he said that, and it was really 1940s or 1950s old white guy. I was just like, wow. I was like, he actually just said that. So why can't and this goes back to another discussion. So why aren't there dwarves? There's nothing in Scotch for the dwarves being craftspeople. Scandinavian lore. Yes, Scandinavian lore is the dwarven craftsman. That's where he got it from. He got it right from the sagas. He got it right from the dwarves that made the mead of poetry, the dwarves that created Thor's hammer, the dwarves that created weapons for most of the gods. So if anything, they should have Scandinavian accents. Why John Rhys Davies decided to make his dwarf Scottish, I have absolutely no idea. And ever since then, I've heard a lot of Scottish dwarves, and I just don't get it. So yeah, are we disservicing it by elves, all our live people with? Well, Blizzard definitely contributed. Okay, so there's a good point. I actually kind of forgot about the Warcraft dwarves. They definitely contributed. Warcraft has definitely hugely influenced pop culture concepts of these different races. So that is. But I will say one thing, though they were derivative. They were one of the first games to give orcs a real culture. And in fact, when Warcraft first came out, I'm like, why would you play anything but an orc? Like what? Like you have a chance to play an orc. Like why would you play anything else? And I understand that's my own personal opinion. So I'm just reading about your raptor character here. So my joke for the whole week has been I'm going to make a mind flayer. And that's been my whole joke. And I forgot in Spelljammer, I think they became a playable race. I actually seem to remember that now. I was just kind of joking around it. Had me at Zug Zug. Yeah. Go back to D&D, you have the race as class. Right. I actually talked about that early on, Russ. Yep. And yeah. Yeah. They weren't as ambitious as humanity. Exactly. And Gygax fell into that and again, I met Gary Gygax. I have a signed player's handbook by him. As a 20-something gamer, when I finally met him, it was like, I'm not worthy. But now, of course, we look back at all of that and some of the stuff his son has been spouting in gaming circles, which is like borderline WP, like borderline alt-right. And you're just like, dude, just shut up, Humanity's thing is a virus. Well, that was kind of a subtext of Lord of the Rings. Things went to hell once humans claimed the world, right? Like that was an ongoing subtext. So, well, Warhammer Fantasy is a satire on the genre. Warhammer Fantasy is a Cold War vision of D&D. And I love Warhammer Fantasy for what it is. It is heretical. It is not proper. It is satirical. No, it's not borderline. Right, PJ, it's not borderline. It says something that like everybody who's dealt with Ernie Gygax has just dropped him like a bad habit. The guy's awful. And again, I don't know anything about Gary Gygax's politics. I met him once at a game con. I hung out with him. I had lunch with him at a little, meet and greet thing. And he was super cool. But I don't know anything about him personally, but I would venture a guess some of his opinions would go more in the lines of the post-colonial in terms of how he would view things, especially in today's world. Whereas I, again, as I've made it clear, I embrace different things in these games. So let's this is the broader socio-political context of multi-species gaming. Why in every D&D party is it an average 10% or less of humans? Corporate Ninja, yeah. Gygax the Younger, yeah. Hope Greenwood is nice, yeah. Why is it that there's only 10% humans in any D&D or Pathfinder or whatever party? Or in the case of the game Nikki's talking about, no humans, basically, But that game was tailored Their stat modifiers are garbage. So is that part of it? So that's funny because a lot of the new versions, humans are boring. She said it. That's it, right? That's what we're all getting at. We're humans every day. Why do you want to play a human in this world where you can play anything? I have a whole diatribe about that too, which is not a retort. I agree with you. That's why fantasy races are much more popular. Races, species, whatever, are much more popular than humans. And that's why they originally gave humans stat and level and ability enhancements and advancement bonuses because they wanted to incentivize people playing a human instead of everybody playing a dwarf or an elf because there's really no reason not to, especially in the early versions of D&D. Oh, I can see in the dark, find secret doors. I never sleep. I kill things like more easily with my weapons abilities. I can't be poisoned. Why would I want to be a human? So I think this also goes deeply into the sort of game you're going to run. And this is something that Adam and I talked about a little bit earlier, something I've talked about with my regular group. Like what happens to a game set in Forgotten Realms or Greyhawk? What is the responsibility of the game master in saying, yeah, for second ed humans basically they had unlimited leveling capacity. That was their big thing. They had unlimited leveling capacity, whereas all the other races were level capped. So that was the advantage. No, in case you ever actually played a campaign till everybody was, So there was always the thought about social stigmatization, right? Why play a dark elf or a half orc? Well, because in theory, you play the game that everybody who's a normal human, you're evil and a monster and everybody hates you. That was rarely enforced in any game I've ever played or ran. Because what are you going to do? Have one player never be able to participate in the adventure? I mean, part of you can be like, well, hi, you picked the drow, so you you don't get to go into the town and talk to anybody. But again, at that point, at what point is that a strain on the game master? And this is what Adam and I were talking about earlier. You sit down to create a Forgotten Realms campaign and somebody suddenly wants to play a Gith or they suddenly want to play, I don't know, a troll. Like, what is the responsibility of the players to sit back and say, this is going to be more disruptive to gameplay? It doesn't matter. A dragon? So Justin plays a dragonborn in our game. And the blue croc. We'll leave it at that. There's a whole line of jokes about his large tail. There's a whole line of jokes about the dragon tail. But aside from that, no, I haven't seen that yet. Yes, exactly. Blake is actually incorporating that into this game. That he's using the rules that basically eliminate the stat and racial bonuses. So initially the Dragonborn was the strangest thing I allowed out of the whole party of 6 players. And I only allowed it because, it was like not that weird. Dragonlance has the history. Oh, cool. I didn't know that, Russell. Okay. I want to take a look at that. I don't really run, I run D&D for a regular group, but it's also so customized that, this doesn't really factor into it. I don't allow everything but the kitchen sink, but like Tom came in for a little bit and he really wanted to play a Kenku. And it worked out perfectly for that game in that the Kenku was found as a captive by the Knoll army and he was an aid to the players, but he was there for a very limited amount of time. So, so I let the Dragonborn in. The Dragonborn's been fine. It's been great. And none of his bonuses are that crazy. And I said, you know what? Dragonborn in Greyhawk, that's where it's set, especially in the Old Draw, the City of the Dragon, isn't that strange. That is in the realm of, and Dragonlance had the Dragonkin. There's like a history of this. So, okay. But if somebody had found, I don't know, Ogre Magi online and be like, I really want to play an Ogre Magi, I would have been like, yeah, no. I don't think we're going to play an Ogre Magi. And not that now if I were running a Monsters campaign, right? Like I think so much of this is context. Like our friend Tim brought up in our chat, well, suppose you want to run a planar campaign. where the goal is to be almost sci-fi, and that you're hopping to different planes. Well, then it makes sense. It makes sense people could play a Zorn, right? I mean, I don't know why you would play a Zorn, but someone could play a Zorn if they wanted to. But Pathfinder, so that's one of the things I really like about Pathfinder, that your species or race, and again, so let's talk about that. Are elves and dwarves in D&D at this point different species or different races, or are they so part of the fabric of the world? Are they just a derivative of human? Oh, there's Skullstein. All right. Skullstein's united. So are we talking at that point about a game that's more sci-fi and it makes sense to have all these strange species, all these strange races? And in your average game, so this was the whole conversation. I'll bring it back to here, where Blake's final comment was like, don't forget, you're not this snail trick. You're not in Middle Earth. Like, you're not in Middle Earth, and again, because he knows I love Tolkien, so he'll always go back and bust on me a little bit about my Tolkien fixation. He'll be like, "This isn't Middle Earth." He goes, "In D&D, an elf isn't a mythical creature; it is just another race that lives in the land." And I said, "Okay, so you just proved my initial point. D&D is its own genre, and that was kind of how I pulled it back in and tied up that thread. And again, it was Vinny from next door. Yeah. Right. Right. It's a dwarf Vinny from next door. Even in Warhammer, even though everybody's misanthropic and xenophobic and everybody's always at war with each other, still you walk into, Mindenheim and you see elves and dwarves. It's not like in medieval Europe where if you literally saw an elf or a dwarf, your whole reality was changed because they are creatures from another realm. And that's kind of what the whole conversation, this several day long conversation on my text chain, and then I kind of bounced it over to Tim and Adam, where I said, so, I kind of proposed it out there to see what would be said. And I think the context of D&D and of fantasy role-playing games in general is so different. Right. If you dropped a crusader into medieval Japan, they would be treated exactly like an elf or a dwarf could be. They would be as strange as an elf or a dwarf appearing. They could be considered a mythological creature. And we have evidence of the first contact of different cultures. The first impression was these strangers are from someplace else, that they aren't from this world. Right, right. In Warhammer, right. A dwarf with an orange mohawk, twice the size as they are, tattooed, right, who can literally kill a troll with their bare hands. Like, literally, like, that's what they're called. They're called troll slayers. That's what they do. So it's a different paradigm when you start talking about these constructed fantasy worlds. And I had to realize that myself, too. Because, again, I'm writing a game that is not historical by any means, but it is rooted in our own concepts of ancient culture. Anything that is not a human is the other. It's outside. It's not playable. It's bad. That's how this world is designed. It's more akin to Hyperborea. It's more akin towards Lankmar, where anything that's beyond what is considered normally human is alien. And I don't think, that's the way I would run a medieval Europe game. That's the way I would run a historical RPG. Even if you run Vampire Dark Ages, or I've played the Vampire Dark Ages and run Vampire Dark Ages. Okay, they're vampires, they're werewolves, they're humans, but meeting a real fairy is this very dangerous and alien experience. And not a changeling, a real fairy. Vampire Dark Ages is probably my single favorite incarnation of the game, which is no surprise considering my fixation with the Middle Ages. But again, that's kind of like Ars Magica. You need to have a group that's kind of devoted to actually playing in the medieval world, not a fantasy world, the medieval world. But I'm really glad. Lankmar wizards are aliens. Exactly, wizards are literally alien beings. And yeah, right, exactly. Right. A biblically accurate angel is on par with meeting a fairy in an actual fairy in a medieval role playing game. Whereas in D&D, they're just little, slives live over by the water, and brownies run around your house, and sprites inhabit the woods, and they're not strange. The average farmer doesn't see them, but they know they're there. So I think we're dealing with Dark Sun. Yeah. Again, Dark Sun was actually one of my favorite settings. It really wasn't even D&D. It used the D&D rules, but it was like gladiator, psychic magic, Conan-ish, and it was so bizarre. Cannibalistic halflings, yeah, yeah. It was actually one of my favorite games just because it was so bizarre. There he is. There's Commander Fuzz. What's going on? Oh, you'll have to catch the recap if you didn't get on earlier. It's been an interesting chat. And again, I was hoping a couple more people who came in from maybe the 20 to 30 age range would have. Nikki's here. Marvin was on earlier. Would have some different thoughts about the multicultural aspects of D&D. So, Fuzz plays with his two young daughters, plays the game with his two young daughters. And I'm interested in knowing what their thoughts are. Oh, there's Marv. What their thoughts, yep, that's cool. Wondering what their thoughts as kids would be playing this game. Justin also plays this with his very young daughter, 6 years old, and their cousins. So, in their views on all this, they got to fight a raccoon. They got to fight an evil raccoon. Yeah, so like younger people especially, one of my greatest experiences in playing First Ed, Tengu Catfolk, yep. And my whole comment earlier was, right, are they an extension of anime? Is this essentially the Star Wars universe at this point, or Marvel universe in a different form? And I don't think that's necessarily bad, even though, again, I'm a traditionalist. I'm the first one to say I like my fantasy slightly, maybe more magical than Conan, like a little bit, or Tolkien, a little bit. But what are the faux options that you preferably never want to encounter again? Like, well, the raccoon's up there. Justin has a whole story of his real life raccoon, and then they ended up running a game where there was one. Foes I would never want to encounter again? It's kind of tough. I don't know. That's an interesting discussion. Well, yeah, of course. Yeah, and again, you know what? And so this was my other comment to both of the groups, both Tim and Adam and my other crew. I was like, guys, think about Dragon Magazine. Think about when Half Ogres came out. Like, everybody was like, I'm going to play a Half Ogre, right? When the playable race of the Drow came out in Earth Arcana. Do you know how many Drow you had to wrangle? Do you know how unrealistic and broken those characters were? Like talk about pushing the boundary of, yeah, exactly. Another reference from Clav, yeah, Half Ogre Ninja, right? Another and yet more references to anime as well, right? Because the Ogre Magi comes to us largely through Japanese folklore, but also it came to us as an oni into anime. So again, saying these influences were never there. Drow are awful. Oh yeah, Drow are awful. And if you let the player really play the Drow, if they didn't kill everybody or sell them into slavery, they could never go out in the sunlight. And then when they did, they had mithril armor and weapons, which made them more or less unstoppable. It was ridiculous. The frog creatures, I don't remember their name, but they, in one of the early Dragon magazines, they appeared as a playable race. So again, all these people like myself who are kind of, yes, yeah. Kuotoa, yeah. Bullywugs, that's it. There was a Bullywug playable race in an early Dragon magazine. And everyone's like, oh yeah, let's play one of those. It's, like I said, my whole joke this week has been who's playing the half mind flayer, half centaur. That's been my whole stick this week to just kind of egg on this conversation. Oh yeah, Drow skeleton entire. So Drow I still use. So we have a Drow in our party. Diana plays a Drow, Drow, and when they finally met other Drow, they were pretty terrified. They found a door underneath the city, which was a portal to the Underdark. And when they finally met Drow in their natural habitat versus the fun Drow they'd been adventuring with, the wacky Drow they'd been adventuring with, they pretty much all just ran. Yeah, they were like, Yeah, no, no. These are some pretty horrible creatures, you know. And I haven't toned that down in this version of the game. I still made them the dark elves of mythology, the dark elves of Scandinavian mythology, who are extremely dangerous, who are not fun. Absolutely. And I think that goes back to what we were saying, Marvin, is that this is now a very evolving instead of a static hobby. And again, you're talking now on the majority to people, late 40s to mid 50s, with the exception of Nikki. And I don't know if anyone else is lurking, but we all have a very specific view of what D&D is and what it's been. And like I said, it's funny. Like when I picture a D&D character, I still picture the player's handbook, the old player's handbook. Yeah, you are definitely the baby here, I think, because I think even Marvin's a little older than you. But I still picture dwarves from that, and right, and that's where my psyche is, because that's when D&D made, yeah, natural bias towards the Tolkien-esque world. That's where D&D made the impact on me. But I'm also really loving people talk about their tabaxi rogues, right? I mean, again, it's so weird to me that I'm like, you're playing a cat person, But yet in Star Wars, we had two of those in our group, and it wasn't at all weird because it was Star Wars. And that's kind of what Tom was pointing out when he said I was playing a Jawa. Like, come on, I want to talk about an unplayable race. I want to talk about a character that's there to kill the party, a Jawa combat engineer. Do you want to talk explosive expert? Sorry, Jawa explosive. You want to talk about a character that's just there to kill the party, like yeah, Cathar. Yeah, the Cathar. That's them. And so that was the whole discussion where Tom like kind of turned this whole thing around on me. And he's like, well, it's like the Star Wars universe. And I was like, man, I was like, he got me, and he was absolutely right. So where does this go from here? Like, and so I started to say before, one of the best games I ever played was in second ed D&D, but they were still using first ed rules. This group that had Lisanne, who actually said she was interested in popping by tonight, but I don't. She's a well-known fantasy illustrator and artist. But I played with her and her significant other, and they'd been playing the same campaign for like 25 years. They had a friend play, and they let their friend's kid play. He was 7. He wanted to play a lizard man prince. And it was perfect, because at that time playing a lizard man was totally weird. But Alan, who was running the game, was like, I don't care, I can play a lizard man. But it was great because as a 7-year-old playing a lizard man, he looked at the world as this in this totally alien fashion to the rest of the adults. And the interactions with this lizard man were so hilarious because I'm like, this is really what like talking to a lizard man would be like. Like there's no frame of reference to like normal everyday reality with this kid. He just got totally into this fantasy world, and he's coming up with the most bizarre stuff, and we're just and the rest of the group's like looking at each other like, no, this is right. This is what dealing with a lizard man as like this medieval human would be like, and it was hilarious. So again, this isn't like a new thing. No fucking Kender. So it's funny. Modern 5-year developers encounter games like Rifts in their childhoods. That's interesting. That's an interesting point because Rifts was the first game of, you want to play a vampire? Want to play a cyborg? Want to play a vampire cyborg? Okay, like that was the first game where and that was so out of control. And again, I only played that once, and I was like, this is ridiculous. Or Torg. I did play Torg a few times. Yeah, that definitely had a Star Wars Cantina to it. Tales of the Floating Vagabond, but that was comical. I mean, that was a drinking game. That was supposed to be funny. So I just don't want to blow past it. The level of sophistication and experience RP can lend to auto rolls as a boon too, of course. Because if somebody, yeah, a vampire dragon cyborg, sure, right, and somebody who's really deeply into role playing, if you want to step in. That's for Justin. Casey's jetting. I don't know if cheers thanks means he's jetting or not, but if he is, I'll see you later. If not, we'll carry on. Someone who's a really adept role player playing another culture or an alien creature could be really interesting. And this I've encountered as a game master, like let's say in Call of Cthulhu, where I had to get into the mind of a Mi-Go. Like, how do you do that? How do you decide what the Mi-Go is going to do? because the Migo is completely alien. It doesn't even function in our reality. So seeing somebody play a really strange character. So yeah, so Marvin, yeah, good point. Tolkienist bias isn't the problem since it's the basis of the game, but the problem occurs when you have when you have a bias comparison and establish elements of the game. How do you prevent races or classes from being OP? That's the ongoing struggle. That's why the comparison to the Warhammer Codexes earlier is inevitable, because if you were playing second ed D&D when that elf handbook came out and everybody was playing an elf who was immune to everything and could wield two long swords and charm people with them, you were just sitting there like, you know, this is completely ridiculous. So exactly, and that goes back, Kaipo, to what I was saying. What I was, yeah, you're cut out for me, and that's what I was saying earlier about, are these biases in the human centric actually a disservice? Getting some severe buffering. Okay, that could be my network or my machine. My machine's actually going into, yeah. I see my network speed, so I might be having some glitching. My network speed is having some issues. Hopefully it won't drop. I just got 0 kbps. Lag, lag. Give it a second. Yeah, I'm gonna let you guys keep chatting. I'm gonna let the lag keep going. All right, looks like yeah. Yeah, I'm getting some pretty serious glitching here. I'll type it. The halfling luck roll now is crazy. Absolutely crazy. All right, guys. I'm getting a lot of dropped frames. Yes. I'm going to leave the chat room open, but I'm probably going to stop the visual stream. This wasn't as hot takey as I thought it would be, but it was a very good discussion. So I'm going to leave the chat room open, but I want to say thanks to everyone for coming out. And maybe we can continue this discussion either next week or the following week or at another point, because it's really interesting. But I'm getting a lot of drop frames, so I think just for the integrity of the video, I'm going to cut it now. But I'll leave the chat room open for a little bit. That helped. That sped me up a little bit. It's still slow, though. Yeah, the voice is taking a little bit less. I'll talk for a little bit. We're getting a little bit back into a green zone. I don't know why. It just really canned out. Of course, my area is a little third world. Those of you who've been to the house know that I get pretty good internet back here, but there are times where I just lose everything. I lose electricity, lose everything. Well, thanks for coming by, Jimmy. Sorry I didn't get to chat more earlier. Like I said, I'll be here for a few more minutes. Yeah, Marvin, the game mechanic perspective, that's definitely been the point of discussion with both of my groups, is that some of the issues that we encounter in a resistance to adding new cultures, races, species, whatever, is that it suddenly becomes this arms race. And I think that's balanced out a little bit, and I think there are ways to mitigate it. Yeah, I'm not that deep in the forest. Just the infrastructure around here is about 80 years old. Yeah, man, no problem. I'll send you an invite and I'll post it. I'll tag you in it. That's what I did tonight. Is I tagged some people in it, and I think they were like, "Oh, cool." I think we have some more lurkers too, which is fine. Again, not everybody's into the chat and being broadcast and all that. Yeah, I get that a lot. People are like, "Oh, I really want to do that." Then it's like, I mean, I got to confess, I did that to PJ a couple weeks ago. They were streaming a video game, and I was like, "Yeah, I'll stop in." I got involved in painting some miniatures, and then I was like, "Oh man," it was like 8:30 by the time I realized that they had been on playing already. But I logged in for a little bit. I appreciate everybody coming on. Good talking to you, Russ, even at a virtual distance. Good seeing everybody. Good seeing Marvin and Justin and Fuzz and Peach and Adam and Tim and Nikki, of course. Anyone else I missed? All right, guys. See y'all later. Thanks a lot. Hopefully, see some of you next week. All right. I mean, that's part of it too, Adam, right? Like, that goes back to what we were saying earlier. Yeah. External cultures that we players enter in the game with. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And imposing some of these issues tends to say more about the players or the GM than it does about the game or the system, right? And that goes what we were saying earlier, Adam. Like I don't think there's anything wrong. And like I said, I joked around with you. I don't have any problem saying no to anything these days. If it's something that's going to be a big imposition on me as a human, or as a game master, or as a teacher, or as a student, or whatever. But I think it's okay for the GM to say, well, how would your air elemental be a player character in this game? And if they can't give you a good reason, and this is where I kind of left the conversation off with you before in text, is if they if they can't really give you a good reason, like you're not committed to letting them play that character just because they want to play a weird character. And trust me, gamers usually want to play the weirdest thing there. And that's been the hallmark of some of these games for a long time. Like I said, the bullywug comes out and there's suddenly 20 bullywugs in a party or whatever. It's these weird kinds of fixations on I want to be the weird different thing. Like I said, when the Drow came out in second ed, it was the same thing. And all these old school players are like, you can't play it. You can't play a dark elf. There's no way you should be able to play that. Well, it's in the rules now. Like, and also, who am I as the game master to just out and out say no, don't do it? I mean, unless it really doesn't fit. And like I said, for the game, the last game we played, and I think Justin's cut out, but the last game we played with Andy, we had, and I played a human, but we had a changeling, we had, I'm trying to think what else. We had a psychotic halfling. That was pretty funny. He's got a serial killer halfling. We had a bunch of really interesting characters that were not typical D&D characters, but it fit into the game Andy was running, and he was totally fine with it. And I'm like, that's cool. And again, for as much as I joke about having my own predisposition because of generational opinions on the games and preferences, not opinions, preferences. Like, I'm never going to be the guy to be like, oh, you should never let a centaur in your game. You're not playing D&D. I mean, who wants to do that? That's just being an ass, I'm playing English. That's not being nice or funny or anything. It's like, if someone really wants to have a game where everybody's playing a unicorn, great, But so in my regular D&D group, it's very much a fun overrides rules as well. It's very light. I keep it very light. The tension should be in the dramatic moments in the game. The tension should not be telling somebody they can't play a character they want to play, or they're playing a character wrong. I mean, again, I've been in groups like that. They're no fun. It's not fun. Yeah, I mean, to a degree, like the rule of cool, the Matt Mercer rule of cool thing, which again, he doesn't even take it to an extreme that some other people want to. You know, I think cool is fine unless it's going to literally disrupt the game or literally possibly kill another player or something like that. Oh yeah, yeah. Well, exactly, and that's and again in the early games, if you were willing to be hardcore and enforce all those social stigmas of playing a half orc or playing a dark elf, it was dangerous to play one of those. You got all these bonuses as a trial, but yeah, you could definitely be killed. Well, and that's a big point there, Adam. And this is what we were talking about earlier. I've also seen a lot of players, and I've never gamed with Nikki, so I don't know. Randomly assigned. So I actually have done that for Call of Cthulhu, and people have said it's one of the best games I've run because they were just handed this character and they had to literally role play this character. But I don't know how Nikki is as far as this goes. But I know early on, a lot of the players that I played with, one in particular, who always wanted to play the weird character, was also the one that almost inevitably screwed up the party or screwed up the game session. And it became this thing where it was just like, dude, like you're doing this just to be controversial, just to be a pain in the ass. You're not, this isn't fun for anybody but you. So, put a band. The DM claimed there were no trees there. Oh, there's no trees here. That's funny. Oh, trust me. I've watched a couple games at cons and I've watched a couple games online where I'm like, I'd last 5 minutes in that group. I'd be like, oh, guys, I got to go. I got to go fold the dishes. Sorry, I can't stay. Because they're just not having fun. There's nothing fun about it. Right. And I think that especially like in horror games and stuff, assigning somebody a character that's outside of they're outside their comfort zone really works. Antagonistic storyteller syndrome. Well, I know you've had some experiences with that, Adam. Ass for short. Yeah, I know you have had. I know you've had in your group more than one possible experience with that, and I've witnessed a bit of it. Yeah. All right. Yeah, that works. Here, let's have the horses stand there. That's pretty funny, actually. I mean, to me, it's so much about the spirit of the game and about the spirit of the game that the group or the storyteller is trying to present too. You know, again, if you're the person who's just trying to disrupt that, like I remember I ran this historical Viking era Scandinavian game was, and the first thing this one guy wanted to play was a Christian missionary. I'm like, okay, so you're literally just picking the one thing that you know is going to be disruptive to this group in this environment. And he was definitely one of those players because he did this in pretty much every game. And he, you know what? He was a very good role player. He role played. I let him do it. He role played it very well. But I was still like, dude, you know, it is. It is a co-op. And that's our whole other discussion. We have a whole discussion coming up about shared governance and storytelling and GMing because that was brought up last week, and it became this kind of sub discussion. So, all right, let's shelve this and let's talk about it in a couple weeks. All right, guys, I think I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks a lot for coming in, everybody. Really appreciate it. And hopefully I'll see some of you next week. I'll send reminders. I'll post. I'll tag people just so that they know that when I'm doing this. Next week, depending on my streaming situation, if my computer, which has to go to the Mac store tomorrow, is still in the shop, might be dicey. Because the only other machine I have here is a really old PC. But I think I can do OBS on an iPad. And I have a decent iPad here. So that might be the plan for the coming week if my computer is in the shop. It's having a display issue. I've got it on another monitor right now. All right, guys. See you later. Thanks for stopping in. Yeah, Russ, we should plan something. Do you do Blood Bowl? We were doing some Blood Bowl. I know Butch mentioned being possibly interested. Thanks for stopping in. I'll shoot you a note, Russell. Well, and we can talk.